Hello, my name is Kamara Holloway. I'm the project manager for the Romare Bearden Digital Catalog Resume here at the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar series, Enduring Legacy: Conversations on Bearden. The event considers Bearden's ongoing influence and impact 36 years after his passing. The precedent of his art and life continues to be relevant to our own times as we grapple with similar artistic and social concerns, especially related to issues of race in America and beyond. Along with the forthcoming catalog resume that will serve as a vital resource about the artists of, this programming provides an opportunity to delve deep into Bearden's world. To that end, the WPI also hosts the digitized Romare Bearden papers on our website, which showcases a range of materials from the artist's personal archive. We encourage you to check it out at wpi.art. This series features conversations with 3 speakers whose scholarship and practice engage with Bearden's formulation of the visual world. Today, we will be conversing with Anne Monahan, an independent art historian. She'll be sharing her research on Bearden that will form a chapter in a forthcoming book called A Usable Past: Race, Figuration, and Politics in the 1960s. Last week, we spoke with Charlie Farrell, the Romare Bearden Fellow at the St. Louis Art Museum. The series will conclude next week on May 22nd with the artist Khalil Robert Irving. You can learn more about all of the talks on our website. The series is being recorded, and you will find the videos posted on our YouTube channel. We will begin with a presentation from Anne, to be followed by a conversation. We will take questions from the audience and invite you to submit any questions that you may have using the Q&A feature that can be found at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I will turn things over to Anne.
Thank you, Kamara. And thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this. I'm so happy to share my work in this way. Let me share my screen. And do this. Then that's working, yes?
Yes.
And first of all, thank you for digitizing all of these Bearden archival materials, because this photograph is from the material you collected or presented, and it's I've never seen it before. I've never seen what the spiral headquarters look like, so this was delightful. All right, so to move forward, my name, as Kamara said, is Anne Monahan, and I'm an independent scholar who focuses on modern and contemporary art of the United States. I'm particularly interested in the construction of modernism, how and why work gets written into or out of art history, how those narratives advance larger social and cultural agendas, and how they shift over time. And as a result, I'm often thinking about issues of legacy, directly or indirectly, and I'll outline a few ideas along those lines today. My interest in Bearden, which started in graduate school, inspired the current book project, which Kamara mentioned, that concerns how racial politics in the 1960s influenced or informed a politics of style. And it centers on Bearden's Projections exhibition at Cordier and Ekstrom in October '64. Again, this installation shot was previously unknown until the WPI digitized this material. So again, thank you. And I'm interested in how that figurative turn in his case, and in fact, it was a return because he'd done figurative work in the 30s and the 40s, was metabolized over the rest of the decade and arguably beyond. As you know, those of you who are familiar with projections, the show consisted of large format photostats, which is what you see here, that were made after small photo montages. And you can see that relationship in this comparison. The original cut and pasted paper photo montage is on the left, and then the larger photostat is on the right. And this work marked a significant break with what he had been at the time known for, which were large, well-received, abstract, impressionist inspired and in fact, that's what they were kind of called at the time. Some people were calling these abstract impressionists because of the softness, not just of him. It was kind of a movement. Sometimes they were called lyrical abstraction. But you see here that they're sort of soft, gestural abstract paintings that fit within a New York school tradition, and for which he was receiving excellent, reviews and presumably sales. But for reasons we'll discuss, in 1963, he shifted precipitously into this figurative idiom, which marks a distinct break with the work that he was doing, both in its attention to Black genre subjects, because the figuration was quite specific, and also in terms of this innovative technique of photostat, which he had not used before, and in fact, which was not commonly used at the time as a fine arts material, although it had been in use for decades in commercial and business applications. This marriage of traditional subject and innovative technique offered a timely new model of Black representation in art that aligned with both the civil rights movement that was then underway across the United States, and with the revival of assemblage practices that was then underway in the art world. This combination brought him an immediate enthusiastic reception. As you may have seen this before, this is the feature article with which his exhibition was greeted in Art News in October 1964, which was an index of that enthusiasm. And this happened at a time when socially engaged art, presumably what the projections would qualify as, was still routinely dismissed or denigrated as social realism. And this reception and sort of rehabilitation in a very targeted way of socially engaged figuration, along the lines of race, changed the trajectory of his career, which, this is probably the easiest way to represent that. By 1968, he was, charged with commissioned to do the cover of Time magazine. He had become, an art star within just an incredibly small window, based on this recuperation of figuration and Black subject matter that, makes his reputation. So this, I would argue, warm reception also shifted the horizon of possibility for Black artists more broadly, including Faith Ringgold, whose die you see here, as Projection's spectacular success inspired and to a certain extent authorized a groundswell of institutional support. And by institutional, I mean museums, galleries, publications, dealers, over the next few years for a rising generation of Black artists, many of whom, adopted a representational style. And this is, I should say, although it feels kind of obvious, that kind of embrace of representation during the 50s was considered like naive or problematic or just completely out of touch. And even Faith Ringgold tells a story about when she shopped around these representational paintings that she made in the early 60s to galleries in New York, and they told her, like, you can't make those. She understood that to mean that she, as a Black woman, couldn't make those, but I've always read that response as like, nobody can make those. Like, representation is just embarrassingly out of touch. And then, within just a handful of years, it becomes a very viable form for Black artists at the time. So by the end of the 60s, the correlation of Black artists and figuration was so solid that it had begun to affect white artists as well. And there are various ways to explore that. I'm going to use this example, which is the New York art strike against racism, sexism, repression, and war, which took place on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum in May of 1970, was led by Robert Morris, who was then a, kind of a critical darling and conceptual artist who was never a figurative artist, in his career at that, he'd done conceptual projects and object-related projects. And he stood on the steps and announced to the group that abstract art was probably middle-class and racist. And that was considered, unproblematic enough that it was just reported as a fact and no one really took issue with it. And then quickly thereafter, or perhaps simultaneously, I'm not sure of when he started this portfolio, the example of which you see on the right. He adopted a figurative style in his own work for this limited, production of anti-war prints. So, this way in which figuration gets recuperated, I think, is something that politically engaged figuration specifically is something that is a legacy of Bearden's project that really hasn't been fully addressed up until recently. Oops. So 2 years later, Bearden kind of reinforced that correlation himself in his, mid-career retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art called The Prevalence of Ritual in 1972, included no examples of his abstract work, nothing from, his very well regarded New York School painting, even though the museum owned one of those paintings in the permanent collection. So, all right. So I'm generally, in my own work, hopeful that attention to this trajectory of Black figuration in the 1960s will not only tell us more about that period, but also perhaps shed light on the recent efflorescence of Black figuration that has become the period style in our own decade and are arguably the last few decades. So I'd like to shift gears now from the legacy of projections. Sorry, I feel like my slides might be out of order. We'll leave that there for a minute. To the legacy that projections created, to the one on which it drew. So it's kind of an inversion of the themes, and hope that's not a problem. And that is, I'm really interested today in Bearden's strategic engagement with art history in this body of projections. And that's a subject that is not unknown, but usually framed in terms of his interest in old and modern masters. And that makes perfect sense because he spoke at length about those connections and he was happy to describe them. But I'm interested in expanding that conversation to include branches of art history that have received less attention in this regard, which is this idea of the Negro image, and that's his term and a term that was used in Spiral at the time, and the assemblage tradition, kind of how they intersect. As has been well rehearsed, projections, and you certainly probably already know this, began as what he describes as a set of experiments. That's experiment is his term. In late 1963 or early 1964, the date is not really established as far as I know. While he was a member of Spiral, the intergenerational collective that he co-organized to consider the role of and possibilities for Black artists in the United States in a moment of relative optimism in the Black liberation struggle. As he later explained, the group, or at least some members of the group, he was speaking for the group, but it's not entirely clear if they all would have agreed with this statement, were interested in identifying or recovering an authentic Negro image, and again, that's his term, that might inform contemporary practice. And this is a quote from this conversation. We wanted to look back into our grassroots, look at these things and see anything that might have been neglected there in the particular image that we can bring forward. And when he's talking about grassroots, he's very specific from the context elsewhere in the conversation, speaking about Black American grassroots, not African grassroots. And he was well equipped to do this kind of investigation because he had known a lot of this work firsthand. He had shown in the 1930s and the 1940s in Negro art shows work like this, early, factory worker, social realist painting, and he had studied with and befriended a number of artists active in Harlem. So he, while Black art production of the 30s and the 40s was not particularly well documented by the 1960s, he had the advantage of firsthand experience to offset that. And for example, Evening 910 461 Lenox Avenue, which you see on the left, depicts a family game night that could just as easily refer to the family game night in Horace Pippin's The Domino Game as it does to the, Velázquez painting The Luncheon or Cézanne's Card Players, with which it's usually associated. And Pippin, in this case, seems an especially apt candidate for this kind of recuperative attention because Bearden met Pippin, who was a self-taught painter, in the 1960s. And at the time, he was arguably the most successful Black artist of that day. And then Pippin, along with many other figurative Black artists of this period, was slipped or, I would say pushed off the radar with the advent of abstract expressionism. And so this, recuperative project of neglected grassroots artists or images, seems exactly the kind of thing that Pippin would be qualified to address or serve, I guess. And the same might be said for the evening meal of Prophet Peterson, which I'm showing you the photo montage, the original, because the photo stat is quite difficult to read. I think that, and I would argue that that's because this was one of the earliest of his efforts in this vein. And I think he eventually, as you can see here, chose very high contrast materials so that, the resulting photo stats are quite graphic, but I'm not sure that that was a plan that was developed when he was making this work. And so the color is much more helpful in sort of making sense of what you see. Anyway, I'm showing you another Pippin here, which is a family meal. And hopefully you can see that the Bearden image is a standing woman serving a tray of food to a sitting man and child at a table in a very nicely appointed home, which is, not necessarily what Pippin's after. But again, there are many other precedents for family meals and, the canon of Black art representations from the 30s and the 40s. And so I'm just mostly choosing Pippin because I work on Pippin also, and I like to use Pippin at any opportunity. It can't be an accident, and I think this is where I do. So here you can see the photo stat that it can't be an accident that Bearden debuted this modern day Negro image in an exhibition and sale that was meant to benefit the Congress of Racial Equality, which you see the advertisement for, on the left, or the catalog for, I guess is more accurate, which was known as CORE, and which by that point had already sponsored the Freedom Riders and the March on Washington and was gearing up to support a summer voting registration drive in Mississippi. So they were a favorite beneficiary of art world support in the North. There were benefits for CORE all over, in Rockland County and New Jersey, and it was and annually because of the work that they were doing. And this photostat that Bearden donated to the exhibition and sale manifested CORE's integrationist ideology in two ways. First, it makes a Black artist visible within the cohort of art stars that are donating to the show. And second, it makes a Black subject visible, on the walls of the gallery. And this kind of visibility was something that previously would not have been available to Bearden if he was working in his more famous abstract idiom, right? At that point, that kind of abstraction values a universal ethos in which, individuals are not recognizable. And so it's not an accident that he, I would argue, chose not to send that work, which would have been a safer fundraising bet, and instead chose this work that no one had seen before, because it does a kind of political work that the abstraction could not do. Moreover, the titular prophet in this painting, photostat that you see, he's on the furthest figure on the right, speaks to the role of the Black clergy's leadership in the civil rights movement, which was a subject that Jacob Lawrence took up in his donation to the same sale. And the bourgeois mise-en-scène of this comfortable interior counters images of abjection, of Black abjection, that were often circulated to galvanize support for the civil rights initiatives. So I think he's, Bearden's working on multiple levels to make a statement within the space of the show with this work, and in a way that previously would not have been available to him in a more conventional New York school.
So we're going to start having a little bit of a conversation about Anne's work. Great. So the project that you're working on started with your dissertation. Can you describe a little bit more about your dissertation and what set you on the course to pursue the project as a whole?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, because it gets me to be able to talk about Ann Gibson, who was my advisor. I think she might have taught you as well, who was just a lovely, lovely woman, and did this amazing project called Abstract Expressionism, Other Politics, in I think it was published in maybe 98 or 99. And it was groundbreaking because it argued that abstract expressionism, as had it been conventionally understood, as large format, abstract paintings by this handful of white male artists, was really a construction, and that there were lots of artists who were not white and not men who were making abstract paintings in the 40s and the 50s, and who had been written out of that history because it was, because it served larger agendas about ideas about whiteness and, universality and et cetera. And she was my teacher at Delaware, the University of Delaware, where I went. And she taught that book in the first semester that I arrived, and she assigned us to work on artists that had been included in that book and that were not canonical abstract expressionists. And I wound up, because I'm always doing something that isn't exactly what people ask me to do, working on Bearden, but not Bearden as an abstract expressionist, more like Bearden's turn away from abstraction and how that worked. Because I was interested at the time in thinking about how he did that in '64, and it was incredibly successful, and how Philip Guston does the same thing, who, Philip Guston, a very established white abstract expressionist, does the same thing at the end of the decade and has a much less successful relationship, with the critics and the market. And it basically kind of shuts his career down for 10 years. But on the flip side, he winds up becoming this hero as a, individualist and, iconoclast. And Bearden never really is, at the point that this book was written and my dissertation was designed, seemed beyond the category of Black artists. And so I was really interested in trying to figure out how and why that happened. And so that was essentially the sort of focus of my dissertation, is comparing the receptions of these two artists who are basically the same age. I think they're just born a couple of years apart, and who would start as social realists and then become New York school painters and then adopt figuration. And yet the trajectories of their careers are dramatically different in many respects. So I kind of have gone in and out of my relationship with Bearden ever since, because I've worked on other things, it's helped me to see what he was doing in more and more complicated ways. So lately, I just finished this book on Horace Pippin, and once I'd spent all this time looking at Pippin, I really saw Bearden's projections in a way I'd never seen them before. I could see all of the references to Pippin and other artists of the 1940s, and trying to, instead of the ones that are usually cited, which are to old masters, and, and it made me want to work on this project in a different way, which is thinking about how he was strategically kind of recuperating art historical references in lots of ways, and what that, how that worked, and then how it got metabolized. Because I think over the decade, Black artists kind of take a cue from his success, but they don't necessarily, and adopt figuration in various ways, but they're not quite as interested, or in some cases not interested very much at all, in the art historical metabolization that he's sort of arguing for. And then by the time you get to Guston, he's doing something completely different. So anyway, I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but that's
Yeah, no, that's good. So what is it about Bearden that's like compelling to you, like compared to the other artists that are out there? Like, why did he stand out?
he stood out initially, like when I started this, because he was the first artist that I knew of that had pointedly like stopped making abstraction at a time when abstraction was still quite viable as a model or a mode, and chose figuration and paid. Not only did he not pay a penalty, it actually like put his career on steroids. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I thought that looking at that kind of suggested to me, especially against the reception of Guston later, that there was a way in which in the 1960s, Black artists were being incentivized to work in a figurative mode, and white artists were not. At the same time that figuration was considered a less sophisticated form of representation. So I thought there was this racialized discourse that went with this sort of tracking Black artists into figurative modes and discouraging white artists from pursuing the same. This was, I should say, it's not just figuration, right? It's a very specific kind of politically engaged figuration. Obviously there are figurative artists like Philip Pearlstein or whatever who are doing something completely different. But that's what sort of started me thinking about this, is that there was this way in which not white artists who were working in a politically engaged figurative mode did not get the same kind of reception. One could argue that they're not as, there were many factors involved in that. But I would say that one of them probably had to do with the fact that there was a way in which people were much more comfortable suggesting that Black artists should represent Black people. Even if the representation of people in the 1960s was considered, not the most cutting edge thing that a contemporary artist could do.
Okay. So there is a body of literature on Bearden that existed, but maybe not with this particular approach. So where did you begin? Like what did you take from that literature and how did you move forward?
Because my take on Bearden was idiosyncratic. I think I had to review the literature and know the literature, to make sure that no one had kind of directed their attention in this way. But at the same time, there really isn't a lot of overlap, as you say. So I mostly focus on archival sources, and that's been sort of my method in general, is that I'm usually interested in kind of theoretical ideas that I want to kind of test or examine through archival research. So I've spent a lot of time in the Bearden papers. I spent a lot of time lately on I'm really interested lately in sort of secondary materials that people haven't looked at, grant applications or other places where he discussed what he was up to that have, not yet really been explored. He did a lot of press. There's this really great, and I think you have it already, but other people may not, press packet that he put together in which he, for the projection show in '64, in which he kind of interviewed himself, and they handed that out about the show. And then really it informs all of the reviews of the show. Like if you read the reviews of the show, it seems like, people interviewed Bearden, but what I think they actually did was take quotes from this self-interview. But they didn't take all of the quotes, right? So there are all these ways in which you can get a much richer and fuller picture of him in these kind of unpublished peripheral materials. So that's mostly what I use. And I'm really, I always come up with kind of odd questions that I want to answer for myself, and it will lead me down these paths where often it proves that there's material that, could be fruitful that I hadn't even expected to find. All of that core material, for example, when I started looking at the core shows, I started looking at the core shows because I wanted to know, I was trying to just pin down the way in which he made the projections, which were the first ones, because he made them in 2 phases, and which were the second ones. And as far as I know, you're going to probably fix this because of the CR, which I'm so grateful for. But at least, as far as I know so far, there's no way to really know which works he made in what order. And so I was trying to get a sense of that. And I realized that the fact that he showed this one projection before he talked with his dealer about making more of them meant that must be in the first group. And then that just made me start looking into the core project and what core was up to and who was supporting it and how that all worked. And that just opened a whole window into the patronage for Bearden's work and the way in which which is part of what didn't make it onto the screenplay. So that's a rambling answer, but it's this is kind of how my research works. It really I find an idea and then I follow it on whatever circuitous path it takes me, and then I bring it all back, hopefully in a written form that actually makes a coherent argument.
Yeah. So were there any other archives about the 1960s that you were able to access?
Oh, there's I luckily had a fellowship in DC for a year when I was for this book project. And at that point, I looked at a lot of stuff at the Smithsonian American Archives of American Art that they haven't put on microfilm, right? I mean, I looked at all the stuff on microfilm, which is very helpful, but then there's a bunch of stuff that didn't get microfilmed, including the Dory Ashton's notes, and she was friends with Bearden and she was friends with Guston. And there's all this stuff in her papers that was amazing. I really found a lot to love there. This core stuff, which is, at the Schomburg, that was amazing. I'm trying to think of what other Bearden stuff, because I did a lot of the basic Bearden research in sort of journals and the reception. And so then I've been kind of building it out ever since with little bits and pieces that I find. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was trying to think. So it's this moment of this shift in Bearden's practice. And we were talking last week a bit about one of those collages that he produces during this period, which is Summertime, which is the St. Louis Art Museum. And so I was wondering if you had an idea or if there's a sense of why Bearden finds collage to be the best mode to adopt at the time.
I have a very tricky idea about that, which I am happy to share, but I will acknowledge that it's a weird one. So I think I've spoken with you about this. Bearden was, to take a step further back, Bearden had a dealer, Sam Coutts, in the 1940s, and he was part of a group of, cutting edge artists at the time that was with this gallery. And I think he was quite happy there, and wrote about kind of the Negro artist dilemma around the same time, suggesting that Black artists can be part of the mainstream and don't need to and shouldn't be making work that kind of is overly representational unless that is their interest, because it will put them at a competitive disadvantage. Then overnight, he lost that representation, as people know, because Coutts decided he wanted to go just hardcore abstraction and Bearden did not want to follow. So this, I think, makes, once you lose your gallery representation like that, I think it makes you pretty aware of what that kind of relationship needs. And so Bearden was signed with the gallery that becomes Cordier and Ekstrom in 50, I think December 59, but arguably, January of 60, as an abstract painter. And the gallery represented abstract painters and they loved him. And he had a couple shows back to back there and got great reviews of the work that I showed in the slide presentation. Sold something to MoMA from that show. Things were going really well. And then the dealer changed ownership and brought in a French partner named Daniel Cordier, who was incredibly successful, really interesting, deeply invested in assemblage practices in France, very connected to the avant-garde. And then they started to populate the gallery schedule with Cordier's artists, Dubuffet in particular, but a number of other surrealists, a lot of assemblage artists. And Bearden got pushed off the exhibition calendar for a couple of years. So like his last show was in 61. He didn't get a show in 62. He didn't have a show in 63. And then I think during that time, he becomes interested in assemblage, which I don't think is a coincidence. And I think that's when he starts experimenting with it. That's when he brings the assemblage materials to Spiral and is like, hey, should we try this? Nobody's interested in that idea. And he's very pointedly not interested in kind of the anti-art dimension of assemblage. He doesn't like surrealism. He makes statements about he's not interested in absurdity. But I think he is interested in this medium because I think he understands that his dealer likes it. And I think he's willing to give that a shot. And then famously, he sends the photostat I said showed to the core show. And right around the same time, his dealer in New York comes to the studio and Bearden shows him some abstract works. And the dealer's like, yeah, I don't think so. And asks to see the photostats rolled up in the corner, and the dealer loves them and is like, can you make more? And I think that Bearden was not necessarily committed to this personally. The way I read it is that was not necessarily his primary interest, is becoming a collagist. I think he was happy to give it a shot because the dealer was enthusiastic. But I think it's also important to note that he very quickly moves away from monochrome images and embraces a kind of painterly collage making, which Summertime is one of the first examples of, where he, and he calls them montage paintings, right? And so I think the longer he is involved with collage, the more he tries to shift it back to the painterly mode that he likes, while sort of still remaining a collage artist, because by that point he understands how successful it's been for him. Like, why would you, throw that baby out with the bathwater? So that's the trajectory I see, is that he also in that period, 67 and on, is moving away too from kind of politically oriented imagery to more kind of iconic images that again fit more kind of unproblematically into a history of art, which again, I think these are all strategies in which he's sort of trying to neutralize the political element of his project and emphasize the painterly one, because I think that's who he wanted to be and who he saw himself as. And weirdly, Projections was like this hinge that kind of connected those two phases of his career.
Yeah. So the vision of Blackness that then does emerge after Projections is characterized by what, would you say? You're saying that it has this iconic dimension.
Yeah, I would say very quickly he really embraces much more pointedly this idea of repopulating the Western canon with Black figures. Whereas in Projections, you can kind of see a much more synthetic thing where he's, doing some kind of current events ideas and some kinds of art historical ideas from European artists and some from Black artists. Like, when I look at the, say, collages of 67 and on, I don't really see Pippin there anymore. Like, I don't, I feel like he moves away from the sort of influence of the 1940s and the 1930s as the further he goes on, and moves more and more into kind of the most iconic works of art history. And doing so also moves increasingly away from contemporary subjects and into these kind of timeless caryatids and nudes that really like exist kind of outside of time.
Yeah. So it's with the Projections exhibition also that he introduces the phrase, the prevalence of ritual, which then becomes the title of his retrospective at MoMA, and people have argued is a summary statement about his work. Do you have a take on the meaning and significance of that phrase?
I don't have a no. The short answer is no. The longer answer is I feel so confident that body of prints must be from like the summer. Like, I feel like you can see that is this, like, I feel like it represents this way he's trying to turn the boat around. And already, he has to make this work. The dealer's enthusiastic. He's excited that they're excited. But I think you can already see him trying to move his project towards something more timeless. And I feel like the prevalence of ritual is like one of the earliest manifestations of that effort. Whereas, like, we know the evening meal of Prophet Peterson is from that first phase, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the, if like 9-10 evening night, like of all of those more kind of situated ones, because there were apparently like 4 or 5 from that first group. I feel like they might be those, the sort of more timely ones were in that first group, and then he's trying to back away. Conjure Woman, I'm betting, is from the second group. Like, you can these people that you would not necessarily meet in person in New York feel like, to me, something that he's trying to introduce early to suggest that his project is not protest or social realist. I think he's trying to temper those associations with these much more spiritual and conceptual and kind of broad ideas. But I don't know what that meant to him specifically. I mean, I feel like I think of it in terms of a strategy more than a but I don't disagree that I think my willingness to see it as a strategy is only a part of what he was up to.
Okay. So let's look at the flip side of this, the reception of these works. What have you discovered about the collector pool for Bearden? Like, who was buying his work to the extent that you know?
Well, that's what's quite tricky, and where all my hopes are pinned on you, Kamara, because the gallery that represented him at this time, Cordier and Ekstrom, they do have papers. The papers are not public, and as far as I know, they don't include a lot of sales records from this period. So it's really difficult to reconstruct that history. The Benjamins are the first people I know. Well, first of all, the Benjamin family are the first buyers of this work, as far as I think anybody knows. And they were remarkable in that they were active collectors. Mr. Benjamin died like maybe in like 68 or something. But Helen Benjamin lived into the 90s, and she was a member of the Whitney Board of Trustees, board, paintings advisory board. Like, she was a very serious collector. And they collected more than they got really heavily interested in Bearden. And after the purchase of the evening meal of Prophet Peterson, which it seems like they didn't keep for long. Like, it seems like they traded up, and they wanted, as you've pointed out to me, they wanted actual collages. They didn't want prints made after collages. And by the time you look at the collector pool for the lenders who lend to the 72 show, which is another good index, it's not clear when they bought, right? Like, it's not clear that those people could have bought like in the late 60s when Bearden was already very popular. And you need to sort of do individual research on all of them, but it's a who's who of New York. Jacob Javits and his wife, Richard Clark, a prominent Black businessman and supporter of Black artists, Carter Burden, who was like this patrician philanthropist who was active in the foundation of the Studio Museum, right? Like, it's like totally a who's who that were lending to that show. Ralph Ellison, but he was a friend of Bearden, so I'm not sure how much of a collector Ellison was, like on his own, or if he was involved in collecting the work of his friends. So which is really remarkable to me, because that's the other question you always ask, is who's bankrolling these decisions? And the collectors to the the Benjamins are white. Many of the lenders to the 72 show are white. Richard Clark is an exception. Spelman College and Howard University art galleries are exceptions. But yeah, he has a very interracial cohort of supporters, many of whom are extremely rich. Dan Dietrich, who was a really important collector, and his wife in Philadelphia, was buying, like, who it was already owned a Bearden by 72. So he also had a range outside of New York. It wasn't just New Yorkers. But yeah, I'm fascinated by the way he was able to pull these cultural elites, basically, kind of from a range of categories.
Yeah. So how would you say a catalog raisonné would help you in your research?
Oh my God, you have no idea. First of all, it's really hard to know. Well, just a couple specific examples, which you already know, but your audience may not. So I was interested in the Evening Meal of Prophet Peterson for the reasons we've already discussed, but there was no clarity on what he actually sent to the core show, because the existing photostats of that image don't correspond to the dimensions that were listed in the core catalog. So then there's just this question of, like, what was he actually doing? Was he cutting down existing ones? Did he send the collage? If he actually sent the real collage, that's a whole different animal, right? Like, is he and your work, because you've nailed this down, is so helpful, because it's now clear that he sent a photostat that previously wasn't known. He didn't send the collage, and then that means that what gets bought, what his immediate return of attention for this work is for these photostats, which is a really big difference than whether he's immediately being rewarded for showing the collages, which are now the much more interesting and subject to collectors. So that was really helpful. I'm also, just to the extent that you can figure out who was buying these early things, which would be just a godsend, it will give so much more breadth and depth to the sort of prestige I just offered. I did that kind of work luckily for me, that kind of work was much more easy to do for Pippin. There was a full list of his collectors when he died in 47. And I was able to really trace the social networks among them and between them and Pippin, and how that informed Pippin's career, which I think was unusual. People hadn't done that kind of work for a self-taught artist before. And it really showed, in a way that previously hadn't been understood, how plugged in he was to the just full-on contemporary art scene. He was not a marginal player. He was quite central. And that kind of patronage research, which you'll be able to facilitate with the catalog raisonné, will really help illuminate those kinds of aspects of Bearden's success. Although people already know he's successful, but kind of the way in which he was successful would be, I think, really exciting to know more about. And you hold the key to that.
Yeah. Okay. So work to be done, and we are at work on it. So this success that Bearden finds, how does that compare? So you mentioned Pippin, but how does that compare to the success of any other artist? I'm thinking of maybe Jacob Lawrence, and then you showed the Faith Ringgold. Is she having that kind of success at the time?
Oh, yes. Well, that's fast. So Pippin was incredibly successful in his lifetime. Bearden was showing at the same time. So was Lawrence. Lawrence was just at the beginning of his career. And Lawrence was, had the Migration series purchased and it was published. And so but Pippin had like 100 exhibitions within like a 9-year period. Like, it's really kind of mind-boggling. And then he died. And then that was the end of it. Luckily, Bearden lived and Lawrence lived, and so their careers morph over time. But both Bearden and Lawrence have struggle in the 1950s when abstraction really starts to make the kinds of figuration with which they were comfortable a very hard sell. And Lawrence winds up working through that and, remaining a figurative artist. Bearden kind of fluctuates. Bearden retires for a bit in the middle of the 1950s, I think because he was really not sure of where to go from where he had been. And then I would say Bearden, after Projections, has the kind of spectacular success that Pippin enjoyed, right? Where like he's everywhere all the time. It's not just he's a fine artist, he just becomes a cultural figure. People are citing his work in things that aren't reviews. He's everywhere. And that is, I would say, I don't even know if Lawrence actually ever achieved that kind of like art star status. I believe he was an incredibly successful artist, and people thought of him and Bearden as the most successful Black artists of the day. But in the 1960s, maybe he was an art star. I feel I'm a little ambivalent about that category. Faith Ringgold, on the other hand, is an art star now. She was not well known at all in the 1960s. Her first show was the one in which Die appeared, and it was well reviewed. She had 3 reviews, and that earned her another show at the Cooperative Gallery where she showed. She did not sell much out of that first show. I think she sold 2 things out of the first show, not the big paintings, these smaller paintings. And she did not sell, I don't think, anything out of the second show. And based on that, she switched media and kind of got out of the painting business and started working in fabric. And a lot of that history is being rewritten right now because of her, she's finally being recognized for the work that she did, but it's altering the way people remember the history at the time, which was much different. I mean, and the fact that she had such limited success in the 60s isn't weird. She was a figurative artist and she was brand new that was her first show. Like, the art world is very conservative. It doesn't usually turn people into successes overnight. Bearden, and he wasn't an overnight success, right? He'd been showing in New York since the 30s. He was showing to great success in the 1950s and early 60s. So it wasn't like he came out of nowhere. It's just this body of work kind of comes out of nowhere.
So you say that Bearden creates the space for like Black figuration to return. So what does that mean for the artists coming up behind him? So Faith Ringgold does get a show. What about other artists? Are they also just following suit?
By the end of the 1960s, by 69, this subject of Black art or art by Black artists is, first of all, a subject of a lot of discussion, but it is everywhere. It's like on the cover of every magazine and journal. It's like there are survey exhibitions being organized around the country. There's a slide set being sold so that people who teach art history can have slides to teach this material with. And so much of it is figurative. There's an ongoing conversation about this, whether Black artists should make figurative work or whether Black artists should make work in a vein that's more like mainstream artists are making. This is a subject essentially that forms the, crisis that Darby English's 1972 book talks about, when the Whitney tries to do a show of Black artists, and there's this schism between people who think that the show should include figuration and the staff of the Whitney that thinks that the show should include abstraction and other forms that would be considered cutting edge at the Whitney. But this rise of figuration and the rise of support for it, it's not so much the fact that artists were making it, to me, it's the fact that institutions want to support that, that is novel. Because and I would attribute it not only, but certainly a part of it, to the influence of Bearden and the way he shows that there's a way forward for this.
Okay. So what is, Bearden's ultimate legacy? I mean, how is he still influencing artists today with this? Is it because of this turn to figuration, do you think?
Well, I think it would have to be the turn to, I think the most obvious way in which people know who he is through his figurative images, right? It took until what, just before COVID, for people to show those abstract paintings, now second at DB Moore, but first in, at SUNY Purchase. They're amazing. Those abstract paintings are amazing. But the fact that it took like 32 years for somebody to think they should get them out of storage and put them together, I think shows the weight of his reputation is sort of in the field of figuration. I'm optimistic that the more attention will go to the abstract paintings because they're totally fascinating and worthy of attention. But yeah, I would say that I think there is this way that I am interested in an expectation or pressure or incentive for Black artists to make representational imagery. Not always, but there is this sort of listing in that direction on the part of, I think, the sort of zeitgeist, maybe. I hate that word, but I feel like I don't want to pin it down too closely. Yeah. And he's he's a great case study in how that works.
Okay. So one last question, because we are at time. Where are you going next? What is the next project that you are going to be working on once you complete this?
Oh, that's fascinating. I had wanted to do a broader survey, and I sort of started to gather information about this, about the reception of like Bearden's peers, and sort of track more broadly the reception of Black modernism over the 20th century, over the mid 20th century, because I really think that's a hole in the scholarship. There's a lot of talk about like what artists were doing, but there's not a lot of awareness, I think, on our part about if they made money doing it, like what was in, if their choices were being incentivized by the market, or if they were just making work that they really didn't expect to sell. Like, how does that Black modern innovation correlate to trying to make a living as an artist? And I'm sort of, yeah, but those are records that are really hard to find. Those are just difficult. So that is, but I kind of have that fantasy of figuring that out.
Okay.
Seeing how it worked in Pippin really made me aware that knowing that about other artists would be very useful.
Yeah. Great. Well, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. We are going to continue our Enduring Legacy webinar series next week on May 22nd. So please join us at the same time for a talk with the artist Khalil Robert Irving. For more information and to find the link to register, please visit our website at wpi.art. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you again next week for the conclusion of our Enduring Legacy series. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you for the invitation and the conversation.